It will take nothing short of 100 proof living to restore lives. Join a conversation between a cop and a criminal with Brian Yates and Chris Pridmore, working to inspire and motivate others, rebuilding the communication breakdown. This is the 100 Proof Living Podcast.
Welcome to a new video season of Conversations with a Cop and a Criminal. I'm Brian Yates.
And I'm Chris Pridmore. And Brian, boy, we've got a lot going on today.
Yeah, we do. So we're going back a little bit. And to start this off, we're going to kind of rewind to the first episode of our first season and go back to the ground zero topic. And we want to unpack that and fill in some gaps that I think some audience members had some questions on that maybe the information wasn't thorough enough. This will be a longer episode. And I think the idea is to go back to a topic that created a lot of thought and also end up with some more tools to equip people to kind of understand the topic and then how to move forward in an effective way. But before we kind of dive all into that, at 100 Proof Living, we've had a lot of changes. Chris, can you give us an update to bring everyone up to speed on where we're at today and introduce our new team member?
Absolutely. A lot of change going on since we closed up the last season. 100 Proof Living started as just a podcast between Brian and I, as he eloquently puts, two idiots talking to each other. And it's turned into, really a mission, so to speak. And one of the things we saw is a real need to have outreach beyond the show. So one of the first obvious things is to start working on our formatting and video. And so that's what you're seeing here today. One of the questions I'm getting a lot is, can you still hear it the same places? If you're hearing it now, yes, but there's a lot of other resources that'll be available. I know that our partners at Rockbox Productions have been working with us on an app. We've got our Facebook page, YouTube, all the channels for podcasts. So expanded reach, and we're really excited about that. We're going to continue with the guest format, but we also have a new addition that I'll introduce shortly. Beyond that, though, a real vision was to take this show and have it be something that's actionable with you in an everyday life. There's only so many times you're going to listen to the show. So the 100proofliving.com website has been born. And in there's content. It's pretty content rich relative to a podcast website, I would think. There's three main pieces that I'd call your attention to. And one is a place called Caitlin's Community. It's writing based on Caitlin Meath and her experience that she's found, victory she's found, and hope that she's offering to other people in her words. The second one, we've been playing with the idea a little bit of it, but it's Brian's Breaking Barriers piece where he just has a lot of real content-rich information. I bring Brian's IQ down to about 14 years old. He reminds me all the time, but he's actually a really intelligent guy, adjunct professor at a large university in Iowa, and now has some really good information on there for those that really want to dig into content. It's good. And then mine is The Journey, and that's just a blog. And what I've focused that on is all of us in recovery and all of us through a lot of stages in life have feelings, emotions, things that get us sideways that eat at us. That blog is really just saying, these are what I feel, and here's my love to you to help you through your problems. And so the site is primarily driven around this additional content. We'll have the podcast on there, as well as a shop that we're going to try to use to leverage some co-fundraising efforts with some partners of ours. The big piece was outreach. Up till now, it's been Brian and Chris, the cop and the criminal. We realize that there's limitations to that because we have day jobs. And I knew some people that would really reach some needs that we had, and we found two primary needs. Our need is to make eye contact in the community, and we feel a passion towards youth and the struggles that they're facing. So the first person that we had that's joined us as a youth ambassador, his name's Bill Price, and he's a newscaster with Family Life Network as his real job. But he's working with us to come up with some innovative programs to reach the youth. And then in studio with us today, our community ambassador. And this is a real exciting opportunity for us for a lot of reasons. I mean, just from the interpersonal connection between the three of us, but also the work that's actually being done beyond a show. We're not here just to do a show. We're here to change lives one person at a time. And the eye contact happens in the community. And so with that, I would like to introduce Caitlin Meath. She's been on the show as a guest. She's a New York State certified recovery peer advocate. She's a representative at Connections Rounded Recovery in Canandaigua, and she does a whole bunch of other work in the community. As an outreach of Caitlin's community, she's going to have a piece on every single show, but will also be a featured member of the show going forward. So, Caitlin, welcome to 100 Proof Living and your first day on the job.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm beyond excited to be able to join this team and to just kind of bring yet another platform to listeners and viewers as far as what is actually going on out in the community, because it really is a heck of a lot. And as Chris had said, that I am a member of the Recovery Center in Canandaigua, and that's just a phenomenal team of people that are putting themselves out there on the front lines every single day to offer that hope and to role model, what recovery looks like. So a few things that I wanted to be sure to touch on and to bring to the table today was that I had the opportunity to present the Recovery Center to participants at the Farmington outpatient here, who it's called Alternatives to Incarceration, and it was a bit of a tough crowd. I don't know as they really knew what I was going to be bringing to the table and why I was really there, but I was certainly grateful for that opportunity. I was able to give them calendars and glossaries pertaining to the Recovery Center, so that hopefully they'll come sometime and check it out and know that they're certainly welcome. Another really exciting thing from last week was that I was able to interview with Bill Price, one of the team members of 100 Proof, on his show Hometown Heroes. And there again, it was a 10-minute segment spreading the word of recovery based on personal experience and the advocacy for change.
On that one, particular, the reach that you had is pretty substantial. That's a large audience throughout Western New York, actually all up in the Adirondacks and a good portion of Pennsylvania as well. So you had some pretty good reach on that interview. I was curious about the AIT, the program you just talked about. One of the things you said is it was kind of crickets in the room.
Yeah.
There's other people that feel that. So we all go in these rooms where people are mandated. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, how did you manage through that? Because that's a challenging one for all of us.
I just kept talking, which was probably a little bit awkward. And someone even said, they started laughing and they said, "Wow, you're really trying to sell this thing." And I said, "Well, no one's talking, so I'm just going to continue to blabber on,
Yeah.
And I do not. I don't want to sell it, but I feel so adamantly that anyone is capable of finding recovery, no matter how low they may have gone. And so I just want to be sure to very clearly explain that this center is here and that there is a recovery community out there. And I did open it up for questions or comments, and I really want their input. This is a community-based organization, so their ideas of what could we be adding to our programming? What are you looking to do in the community? Do you want to facilitate something? What are your strengths and your aspirations? So I really did not get a whole lot of feedback in that particular setting, but they openly welcomed me. They were very kind. I had all eyes on me, very interested. But I could see that hopelessness in their eyes, and it was something I am very familiar with. It was really heartbreaking, to be honest. And those are the situations where I wish I could shake someone and just through osmosis give them this thing that I am so beyond a doubt blessed to have found. And so I guess that's the point of planting a seed.
Right.
So, Caitlin, in the different audiences that you do speak to and share a pretty consistent message, what do you think it was about this group? Was it the stage they're at in the process? Was it maybe some groupthink where nobody wanted to speak up unless someone else spoke up? Or what do you think it was? But because I remember when you mentioned it that it was like crickets and it was a little bit of an awkward experience. What was it about that group that you think gave it such radio silence?
I do believe that they view that situation as more of a punishment than maybe the privilege that a court may be looking at it as. And there too, I can remember that mindset. It's almost like, a fog eventually gets lifted and we start to see things for what they really are. But when you're living it and you're in that moment, gosh, it's so hard to see anything but maybe, some blame or the idea that it's a punishment. So I don't know as they particularly wanted to be there. They
Sure.
probably didn't. So I was happy that I could maybe break up their day a little bit, look at someone different, hear about something they've never heard about before.
I think
Sure.
therein lies the heart of what you do, though, is as you go forward and you do this work, and this is the thing that we need to encourage people to do, is sometimes it's not in the limelight. Sometimes you're not doing a podcast that happens to be a little bit fun. Sometimes you have to go sit in a room full of crickets just to get that seed of hope, because you don't know who you're going to make eye contact with, that you're going to change their life. You never know.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think too, if you go back to, when we were kids and, sat through fire drills in school, we didn't necessarily really want to do it unless it was an interruption from learning, which was awesome for me. But, I think it's that idea that sometimes in those seasons when you don't want to hear it, someone that's willing like you to go out and plant those seeds, when the time does come, they're going to have at least a little bit of knowledge and some tools where they know where to go, or they have some hope to grab onto. So I think I don't want to derail you from your updates, but I think that's really important, because as we get into this today, I feel like those are the types of things that we really want to highlight.
And I mentioned the interview with Bill. So there again, I think just getting the awareness out there that there is another way to live, and to tell a very brief synopsis of my story, and some of the tragedy and heartache that has been in my story. But I stay sober through it, and that's, at the end of the day, that's the point. And hopefully some words that I used or some message that I shared was relatable to someone. I was always taught to, when someone's sharing, to find the similarities, not the differences, because I can certainly pick apart the differences. Oh, this person, I didn't have it that bad, or, and that's where we can really derail ourselves. So if I can just look for those similarities in a story.
Did he say when that was going to air?
I believe he said it would be in a week. So I called in last Tuesday, so I'm anticipating next Tuesday, next week.
Yeah, I was just curious. Yep. I mean, even though this is going to be a pre-recorded show, it's still that date reference. They can look that episode up. So pretty cool.
Yep. I don't want to say favorites, but this is one area of my work that I'm very, very passionate about, and that's being included in some of the Ontario County Drug Court staffing procedure. More than anything, I sit back and listen, and that's just what I want to do, and I want to just be a part of that conversation. And I learned so much through that process. So that's really cool. But there again, that also depicts I don't want to say levels, but the different maybe motivation or willingness that different folks are at, and what recovery looks like for different people. Sometimes it is that mandated version, and that's what a lot of people need up front, or they need that law enforcement part of it.
Right.
Caitlin, for people that aren't aware of that program, can you explain it a little bit, just kind of what your role is and what the program is designed for?
Sure. So I know Monroe County has a drug court that proved to be very successful. They also have opiate court. There's veterans court, mental health court. And so Ontario County has a phenomenal program that they're running. And essentially that's all different members or components of the legal system, the judge, peers, mental health clinicians, substance use clinicians, all of us sitting in one room and literally going through every participant of the drug court to see where they're at on a weekly basis, and then what action steps need to be taken from there. So my role is very, very minimal, but I do represent a person in recovery. I represent a peer. Sometimes I'll just kind of sit there and I'll shake my head like, no, that doesn't sound like some accountability needs to be taken there, or, and I have spoken up actually a few times. I'll give myself a little more credit than that. So I spoke up. This was a couple months ago, and I said, can I just say something? I said, I appreciate all of the work that they're doing there, and their goal is to save lives. It really is, and I see them sit there and deliberate on one individual at a time, relentlessly. I mean, they take this with the utmost care and concern. And so that it is not by any means some sort of like radical punishment. They want to sanction everyone. That is not what it is. And it's cool to be on the other side of that. But I did share with them that looking back in my story, there's sometimes hard choices that I was just not capable of making for myself that someone else made. They saved my life. And they were things that I really didn't like at the time, and I did not respect. whether it be an arrest or my mom setting a firm boundary that I do not show up at her house, or, those things that crush you and break your heart to have to say you're terminated from drug court or whatever it may be. But in the long run, that could be what saves someone's life. And I really wanted to convey that. So.
Sure. Well, and from a law enforcement perspective, I'm a huge fan of that program because I think it helps with perspective, right? You bring a viewpoint to the table that nobody else at the table has. And I think it's kind of that idea of insanity. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And if law enforcement continued down the same path to always approach, whether it's the addicted community or, other segments of the community the same way, they're going to have the same issues. And with the overdose rate and with all of the other things that we have going on, I think having that collaboration is huge. So it's great to get to know more about that. And that some counties actually are doing that actively. I think there's still a lot of places where that needs to filter out, because then I think you address it on a broader scale.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that we all play a role. We need the entire community in order to reintegrate these folks. The other thing that was really, really special to my heart was being able to interview with Dewey and Donna Flad last Thursday for Marshall's Way documentary. On a personal note, that was probably the toughest speaking engagement that I've done yet, just because I really have the utmost respect for their mission and just for their hearts and the grieving process they're going through. I know the grieving process on my end, but I certainly cannot imagine it from a parental standpoint. And it tapped into some of my own personal grief, that's for sure. They had a box of tissues right next to me during the recording process.
Yeah, I'm sure. The clip that I saw of that, I know you fairly well. We've had a lot of conversations about a lot of things, and I tell you, the emotion you could see just in that short clip, it's going to be a phenomenal documentary, and it's going to be tough to see it, truthfully, because even in that small clip, to see the heart, the stories that you've even told me, to have it put in that limelight was very powerful. So, I mean, the work that they're doing, I know they're fundraising for it and a lot of that work, and we're going to try to support them where we can, but it's phenomenal.
And they really know what they're doing. I mean, they had these lights set up on me. I was sweating. They had 2 different cameras pointed at me. They were doing mic checks and all of that. So they're really pouring their heart into this behind the scenes that the general public might not be aware of. So I just really want to make that clear that they are working diligently on this process while simultaneously grieving.
And they do need support.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when you get a chance to see it, know what didn't just fall out of the sky. It was a lot of work and a lot of cost to do it, but it was with the right heart. And
in my vision, something that would, I think, just be so cool once this documentary is completed is, maybe it could be something that's shown within inpatients or at the jail. Sure. Or, I think this could really be something that could touch hearts on a very real level. So I just envision all of the...
Do they have an idea, like launch dates and stuff? I wasn't really clear on...
Well, I know that when the weather gets nicer later this year, they still plan to do their hiking, I think.
Oh, that's right.
The El Camino, so it'll be a process.
Yeah, it's awesome, though.
So the last few things that I wanted to be sure to touch on were that at the Recovery Center, our programming, I just would really encourage anyone to stop in and just check it out, get a calendar of events. We also have a Facebook page. But 2 really cool things that I find personally remarkable are that we are offering an active parenting course. And a lot of times we have agencies outside of us come in and facilitate these for free. So, that's the community all coming together, rallying together. That's a 6-week course. It's, that real action to rebuild and empower those who have lost, whether it be custody or just need some more skill building with parenting. And lastly, we do have a community Narcan training coming up, and that's on January 30th at 6:30. So I encourage anyone to take part in that as well.
That one's actually funny. I've been dropping those sheets with Uber drivers because obviously I have to use Uber a lot. They're all saying, "No, what do I do if somebody's in the car?" And I said, "Well, funny, we've got an Narcan training, so I've been handing those
really
flyers
cool.
out."
Good idea. Yeah, we do have plenty of flyers.
Yeah. So they're actually seeking it out. So the word's getting out.
Good,
too.
good.
That's awesome. Well, Caitlin, this is thanks for those updates, and I think this is where the crux of what we're trying to do is, because those are the types of efforts that are, changing lives, and we talk about that. Change lives. You're out there living a changed life, and you're using that to change the lives of others. And I think it's easy for the masses to see the rise in addiction problems and the rise in overdoses and the rise in suicides and some of these issues that we have. And it's easy to just want to kind of step back on the sidelines and not do anything, because it feels like collectively the rope is slipping through our hands and like there's nothing that we can do. But you can't boil the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. It's changing lives one at a time. And so I'm super excited to hear those updates from you on a regular basis, because we'll get to see how some of those programs are growing. And I think along with you, we'll be able to kind of feel the barriers and the pains that come with developing stuff like that and getting people plugged in. But I think this is also a great outlet to tell people what these resources are, because it may not be necessarily the person at the worst point in time in their life. It could be a family member. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that program was available. Oh, I didn't know that was a resource that I could get for my son, or I could get for, my wife, or whatever the situation is. So thanks again. And just as a side note, I have really enjoyed getting to know you from a distance, and absolutely love what you're doing. You bring a value to the table in all of those circumstances. And in this show, and then the other things that we've talked about doing in the future, you bring a value to the table that nobody else does. And I'm grateful for it. And we're blessed to have you on board. So yes, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Now we want to dive headfirst back into Ground Zero. If we go back and remember that first episode, try to capture one of those images in your mind of 9/11 after the towers had come down. And I have it in my mind, and I don't remember if it was from a news clip or what it was, but there's the jaggedness of the buildings, and there's just massive piles of rubble. You can still see some smoke billowing from little corners, just total devastation. And that's the imagery that we're using for this. That was Ground Zero. We determined it was Ground Zero. It started becoming a phrase used in the news. But then we took that as kind of an object lesson to represent some of those Ground Zero moments in our life. And specifically, we talked about Ground Zero moments, Chris, in your life. We used when Pat was on, Pat Miletich, he gave us the example in his life. And for the most part, we're talking about circumstances where we have created this disaster on our own. I don't want to leave out the population of people where Ground Zero can be something that happened to you. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be something terrible that happened, tragic that happened, that was unfair and it was not of your choosing. But for the most part, we're really addressing this, this nature that we have to just be self-destructive. And so moving forward, Chris, can you talk a little bit about how this imagery of that 9/11 Ground Zero really applies in some of these self-destructive, catastrophic circumstances in our life?
Absolutely. This subject, as we've gone through, has come up over and over again. And the idea of the vivid reality and making sure you don't lose track of that. My life obviously has a lean towards addiction and recovery, because that's what I can relate to. But the imagery for me is really this idea that the building has collapsed. And you're standing in this ash, and pieces are still falling down, and it's from this life that you once knew, or that you caused, or some circumstance that happens to you. And I think for this show, unlike where we have been before, it's really about making Ground Zero not Groundhog's Day. You don't want to be there all the time. You want to move forward. And, one of the things that I've really kind of grained in my head at this season of my recovery is to come off my leash, recognize that there are insecurities that I have that hold me back. Heck, doing this show, there's insecurities, there's things that play in my head, and it doesn't matter. These Ground Zero events are about decisions. In AA, they talk to us about taking the lead. We're not sitting passively. So the Ground Zero moment, though, is really that place where that situation has landed, and now you've got to make choices. You've got to consider other options, or you stay there and repeat it. When Brian and I were talking, one of the things that came to my head is for this show and for other things, when we create this vivid reality, we don't want to lose sight of it. But in that moment, we also don't want to stay there and just keep throwing up pieces of the building that just fell and say, oh, look, the building's still falling. I can't move. We got to get out of that mess and go forward.
Well, and I think part of it too is understanding, first of all, you said, consider other options, but you have to understand that there are options,
Correct.
Right? I mean, I think it is, Caitlin referred to some of the programs that are out there. And I also think that sometimes we get in these patterns of thinking as we grow up, where we don't know any other way, and we're not even considering any other way. Certainly in that moment of a ground zero, there's no hope there. And so sometimes it takes somebody, even Caitlin recognized, sometimes it's someone else kind of extending that hand to you, someone showing you a picture of hope. And so as you consider options and choose an option of a plan to move forward, it's very clear that at ground zero, the objective is not to rebuild what just fell down. It's to build something else. And I think sometimes we just get caught up in this, I ended up in jail. I ended up losing a family member, and now I'm just going to try to reconstruct that. No, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. So it's part of this is this, awakening that I can't keep doing it that way. And, as we get in, we did a whole show on self-discipline. Self-discipline is not a comfortable thing, but it is a pattern of behavior. And sometimes we have to set that new pattern of behavior. I mean, Chris, talk again a little bit, and Caitlin, jump in too, where you had to set new patterns. And what did that look like? But not just specifically the technical of, I journaled or I did these specific things. Include that, but talk a little bit about what was the impetus to get you going. You can have people come alongside you and keep you going. We'll talk about some of those ebbs and flows, but where was that kind of gumption? Where was that initial inertia to get you going into those new patterns that were not your patterns from before?
In my case, it took a couple different things. There was that determination. There had to be a place where I was just tired of constantly being in this falling apart world, and I was going to have one burst of energy left here to see if I could make it, and I was going to do something with that. It did take some outside influences too in my situation. We were talking earlier about AIT and probation experiences and things like that. That forcible influence was important in my life as well. The accountability measures. But I think that the go forward, the reason I hold to, I know it's not about just tactics, but the reason that I hold to journaling and things along those lines is that I found that in any new story has to have some deliberate, intentional actions associated with it. I feel like for me, I needed to have that in writing in front of me with somebody being accountable to that. I've also spoken on the show that anonymity, while I believe in the organization of Alcoholics Anonymous wholeheartedly, for me personally in my recovery, anonymity was a breeding ground for failure for me. So I needed to have not only a plan, but a plan that was accountable to other people to have visibility to it.
Yeah. Chris, can you press into that a little bit? Is this where accountability was difficult for you? Because I want people to understand where, for some people, that is a protective thing, and whereas for other people, that can be a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, Caitlin, did you have something you want to add to the piece before?
Sometimes it's a little difficult jumping in with you two. You guys have such a rhythm going, yeah. And then my mind is like the wheels are turning. Yeah. I just wanted to comment, one thing based on what you had said, Brian. When I think back to that very moment when I feel like almost like those chains fell off of me and all of this very heavy weighted baggage of just, this is it, doom and gloom. I literally needed one person, and this particular person had to be someone that I, for whatever reason, put all of my faith and trust into at that time. I needed him to believe in me, and in that moment, he did. And he had tears in his eyes and was begging for me to get sober. That's what it took for me to even consider that, hey, I can do this. There's something inside of me. So I needed that outreach of a hand. Mm-hmm. And I think for me that God knew he was the only person I was going to listen to that could get past that fog, is what I keep using in a way, because it's like right. This delusional fog. He was the only person that, in his hand reaching out, his teary eyes, asking me to get well, that's what I would listen to. And then from there, of course, my recovery took on a whole different outlook. But, and I thank God for that. Gosh, every single day. One other thing I wanted to mention, and we talked about this at an AA meeting I was at last night. We talked about meeting calamity with serenity. And I just think that's such a really powerful thing. It actually comes right from the Big Book. And today I am able to meet whatever calamity comes my way with serenity. It's messy at first. It's not always pretty. You know, I'm not trying to downgrade that by any means. But there is a peace with it all. And that is what my life looks like today.
I think that does play, Brian, you were asking about accountability. There is a measure of that because you described an initial phase where somebody could influence you early on, and then you've probably had a number of measures, and then you married that up with accountability, calamity, and serenity and things. And one of the challenges that I have, and I did have early on especially, is not projecting too far in the past with my guilt, not projecting too far in the future of how terrible this is going to turn out. Because what I found is 100% of the time, if I have two options, I'm going to pick the negative one. That's what my life is going to become.
Sure.
Or if I'm going to have a thought about what happened because of my behavior, it's always going to be the worst possible scenario that I could have made it better. What accountability does, and people around me did, is they said, well, some would just say, quit whining. Others, but there were moments where those timing pieces hit. It wasn't just one person. So
I think you both touched on something that's super powerful, is trustworthiness. So, Caitlin, in order for you to really give in to that person's plea, you had to have trust in them. And I think that's important as in any space in life, whether it's trying to lead someone through a difficult diet, right? You don't see some big duffel bag get up on TV and tell everybody what to do, and they're going to follow his, they're going to follow his lead. Because,
that's real nice, Brian.
Yeah, honestly, there's no trust in that. What do? We put up these fantastic models, and they talk about how they did it, and then here's how you're going to do it. And in that small kind of quirky way, you're putting trust in that person that you want their path to work for you. And it's the same whether, look at when a marriage goes badly. If someone wants to figure out how to put their marriage back together, they're not going to go to a singles bar. They're going to go to a counselor or a pastor or a mentor or a friend that has gone through it and gotten to the other side. It's that trustworthiness that I think is powerful. And Chris, as you talk about accountability, I'm not going to choose to become accountable and vulnerable to someone I don't trust. Right. And so I think that's where we have to be authentic in the things that we do for our family and our friends, so that when someone goes through something like this, they know that someone that has a true north can be reliable. And that reliability and trustworthiness, I think, all plays into that accountability.
You just mentioned something that was a real aha moment, other than your duffel bag comment. My biggest accountability partner, for real, was pain. My pain became so great and so desperate that even today, the remnants of it exist as recently as last evening. It forces me to write and invest in other people's lives in the evening, because I feel these things so raw that without other distractions, they become almost consuming. And so that has been an ongoing accountability measure for me. And my challenge on that has been to not let it consume me, let it become a driving factor. As you look in the Bible, and the thorn in the side, it is a driving factor. It never went away. And, for me, that thorn in the side, in some respects, I'd like to go away, but I do think it fuels my need to be authentic, my need to stay on the path, no matter, because the two, we've talked about this too, and I know Caitlin and I talked about this on the side as well. My two most opportune days to screw up everything was my worst day and my happiest day, because my guard's down on the happiest day and I'll screw up. That's where accountability comes in. And my worst day, nobody's saying just chill out for a minute, get through it. It's only 24 hours. You're going to be fine. No, I'm just like, where's a match? I'm burning the city down. You know what I mean? And so accountability and that outside influence, when we can't get out of our own head, sometimes it goes in the building, grabs us and yanks us out of the fire.
Yeah. Well, and so as we go back to that kind of 9/11 imagery, we talked about options. When you're at a ground zero, you find yourself in court, you find yourself in a hospital, you find yourself with a failed marriage, you find yourself overweight and unhealthy, whatever the issue is that that has kind of devastated your life in that moment. One thing that you have to choose to recognize is that the option to stay with where you're at is unrealistic. Can you imagine right now what Manhattan would look like if they didn't clean it up and rebuild it? And I think that's a picture for our lives. If we go in, find ourselves at a ground zero, at some point, yes, there's a grieving process. There needs to be some, re-energizing, and sometimes it's just taking the hand of that person that's reaching out for us, like Caitlin talked about, and allowing them to lead us. But you have to choose this new path. And so, as we talk about building a plan moving forward, I think there are different things that work for different people, right? I mean, I'm such an imagery based person when I learn and when I teach, because I'm just simple minded. So I can't just synthesize a whole bunch of data, and I need that image. But in this idea, as we develop this new plan, I think that there has to be some, I don't know, you guys should speak to your individual stories or stories of people around you, but there seems to be this one anchor. There has to be an anchor, and I realize that faith is kind of an overarching thing, but it's super powerful, right? It might not give us the technical aspects to go through for recovering a marriage, for losing a child, for all of the many things that people go through, but it does seem like there has to be one stake in the ground before you can move forward to get to that next stake. Is that something that you guys can speak to?
So for me, that one stake would be willingness. And it's been willingness, whether it is to take whatever action step necessary to get and be sober, or willingness to reach out to my higher power, willingness to pick up the phone. Willingness has been, and open-mindedness has been the key ingredient to pretty much anything that has started for me. It had to be, my mindset had to shift, right? Because the things, like you explained, Brian, that my circumstances were not changing. If anything, they were just getting worse and worse, and they were on repeat. So something did have to make a switch within my brain and my mindset.
That makes sense. The switch for me, I don't know if it was a switch. I was trying to think about that question, because that's a tougher one. I think it was a couple factors, but maybe, if I'm honest about it, I think it was competition. Because, even in, I was a 2-sport athlete in college. I competed a little bit in fighting. Always had like this, a little bit more of an aggressive nature about me and a competitive nature about me. I remember I was just writing actually last night about the night before rehab, and I remember going into rehab, and when I started to do it well, I wanted to do it better. And then, I got outside and I wanted to do better, because this was starting to feel like I was accomplishing something. So I wanted to go up the levels in the video game of life. You know what I mean? And I think that was a real anchor for me, that even when everything else sucked, as a competitor on a soccer field, if we were losing, I was the guy running harder and smashing into people and trying to get the ball at all costs. And I think that actually possibly was one of my anchors. I'm just kind of recognizing it now as we talk. But I do think it's a factor. It is a factor today for me to maintain my sobriety. That's for sure.
Well, sure. So then take a look at that, because I like what you guys just did, is identified two different things that work for two different people, and you continue to lean into it. Because, Chris, I know for a fact that you continue to lean into your competitiveness, whether it's professionally or in relationships. Certainly as a peer, you are tenacious in following through on those things. And obviously, Caitlin, willingness. Very few people, not very few, maybe that's harsh, but not a lot of people are willing to go out and passionately help others the way you do. There's a willingness about you that obviously permeates your life. And I think that sometimes it's a matter of finding what our strengths are and leaning into those, whether that's for sobriety or for getting healthier or recovering a relationship, whatever those things are. It's leaning into our strengths. And so as you build, now there was rubble, we're in the ground zero. We've developed this, kind of new plan of hope that we want to rebuild something new. And the one thing that I keep coming back to, and it's actually a biblical concept, but what I really want to speak into before we wrap up today, kind of two things, is first of all, how can we really speak? The person that's typically listening to these shows is not the person that's at a ground zero. It's someone that maybe was at a ground zero and they're just looking for other resources to keep moving forward on their healthy path, or it's someone around them, right? You guys are peers and you have family members that have been through ground zero. I certainly do. And we need to be equipped with how to help those people through that. And then also, this idea of, kind of once you have a plan, and whether it's AA or whether it's counseling or, all the tons of different options, I think we have to be encouraging to people on how important it is to stick to that plan. And so the idea in Christianity is don't become lukewarm. Well, how can you avoid becoming lukewarm? Because if you think of a tea kettle, if you fill a tea kettle full of water and put it on the stove and turn it on, at some point, what's going to happen? It's going to start boiling, and then it's going to start whistling. The second you pull that off the flame, it microscopically starts to cool. And I think that can be an image where if we divert from our path, if we decide to take a few days off from meetings, if we decide to take a few days off from the reading or the journaling or the things that we have chosen to get us to where we want to be, we can start to cool down. We can start to allow those emotional inputs to really pull us kind of out of alignment. The head, heart, hands model. The things that we pour into our head ultimately become our passion, ultimately become our actions. But we can get pulled one way or another by these emotional inputs. So, Chris, we've spoken about this before, but what are some of the things that, in the 24-hour cycle that you use to recalibrate so that every day you can kind of start out realigned? Maybe you made a mistake yesterday. Maybe you kind of veered away from that disciplined path. But what are some of those things that you can do and equip others with that really help with that? I'm going to do it today, and here's how I'm going to do it today.
For me, probably the foundational thing is ownership. It's nobody else's responsibility for what goes on in my life. I mean, it has to be my ownership over the good, the bad, the ugly. I also think that as this new stage of life, as I understand and you talk a lot about appreciating people, this has genuinely been a huge factor in growth for me. And that is actually reaching out to others and sharing love with them and having them understand that they have value. I've learned something about myself that maintains my own health is that I can't control how people love or treat me. But I noticed something about me is that I actually feel loved by sharing love. And that was something that was really important for me to know in a healthy way, learning how to handle that whole thing. But that's been a huge growth process for me because if I don't learn how to manage just that piece in my life as a passionate human being, I fail. Because I can get sideways, self-worth, regret, oh, you don't deserve this because that's the way you treated past relationships. That all plays in. So for me, maintenance is mostly where I've written on this and I don't want to plug the website, but the truth is I did write on this, and that is get out of my head. There's a place that I should be in there for a minute to clean the socks off the floor, put them back in the drawer, and get out. And these are things that are daily 24-hour things for me. The other part, too, is the 24-hour notion, that expectation that I really only have to do this until I go to sleep. Whatever it is, take crap from somebody, have a good day, just set myself up for a good night's rest, and then tomorrow have this plan that I know is at least a predictable projection of what I'm going to do when my eyes open up. Everything goes to heck as soon as you wake up anyway, but at least I got a starting point, and then that day, I manage that day, and I commit that day to be a sober, giving man.
Okay, and what are some of the things that you use maybe yesterday was a bad day. What can you do to not spiral downward today? What are some of those things that you kind of latch onto as part of your process, your part of your routine that gets your head right when you know you need to?
I think a lot of what Chris had said, that keeping it in this 24 hours in this day, not getting too far ahead of myself, and also not staring too long at the past. I think identifying that for me, a lot lately has been relinquishing control, and that's not controlling people, but it's more so controlling outcomes. Because I'm a very fear-ridden person, so I always anticipate the worst. Just like I used to always kind of make inevitably the worst decision. So I really need to rely on others around me, that third party. Whether it be my sponsor, my family, my daughter. My sober support network, because, I guess I have a healthy fear of ever returning to that life. I'm not sure if that really covers it, but that's my mindset from the time I wake up until I go to bed. And, I have a routine that's very important to me in terms of the morning, getting on my knees and saying, a third step prayer. it's really that I don't even know how to necessarily put it into words, but how I set up my day, put it into kind of
Routine.
chunks, but it has to be a maintenance. It has to be every single day that I commit to making these actions, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. And on that note, I have found that the things that make me most uncomfortable are what I should be doing, realistically.
That makes sense. An observation that I have actually in your life, and one of the things I draw from that I say, okay, I want to be that way. Like I look at Eric Foster and how passionate he is, a mutual friend of ours through recovery. He's been on the show. I look to him as like, I want what he has in terms of his passion, and that, man, I see that what he does there and I draw from that. Brian, I draw from him in terms of how he thinks through things, and he's more stable on how he processes information and strength. But when I see how you handle your recovery, it's been something that's been helpful to me in that no matter how you're feeling that day, like I get to see a little bit more about how you're feeling because of our friendship, but I've noticed that you still go forward even when days don't feel good. And even when your plan doesn't seem like it's going the way it's supposed to be going, I found that you've dealt with fear in a healthy way. And for me, that's been a strength because fear is one of my triggers. Controlling behavior is one of my triggers. Procrastination feeds into it like a monster. And if we don't capture those things, we go sideways.
Well, I very clearly identified through working with a sponsor all of the, like you say, kind of the trigger points.
Yeah.
So in my day-to-day activity today, I almost try to do the opposite. I'm still doing that. Just like when you're in inpatient early on and they say first thought wrong type of thing, right? And my head was so delusional. Sometimes my actions just based on fear or based on victimization, self-pity, whatever it is, I still have those things, but I just now have the discipline and kind of the training to know that I need to either reach out, get some other input on this, or I need to just literally do the opposite thing. And like you said, really working through fear for me is a big one.
Mm-hmm. I could see that.
Well, and we did a whole episode on grit, and that's exactly what you guys are talking about, is that when things get difficult, you're going to continue to go forward. You're not going to retreat.
Yep.
And I think that self-discipline, sometimes it's self-control, but I
would say that along with that, though, the reason it happens is in some respects, we're being taught a little bit more selflessness than we had before. I can tell you that those days when I feel like crap, and if I know somebody needs help, I will go there. And it's not something great on me. I've seen you do it too. Brian, I know that if at the drop of a dime, if I ever needed you, and I have needed you, because there's one day, and this is a little bit too much disclosure, but I was going to get sideways and punch somebody right in the friggin' head. I called him.
Yeah, absolutely.
He wanted to punch me in the head and come over and take the guy's place, but...
Well, and that ties into that I fed on my emotions for so long, right? My emotions were my driving force. I was very impulsive, and if I felt sad, then I needed to go numb it with a drink or a drug or whatever it is. Or even if I was happy, and now I need to not drive based on my emotions. So keeping that in check is a very, very critical thing in the recovery process.
Well, and I think, too, encouraging people that, Chris says it a lot. Caitlin, you've mentioned it a few times now, this idea of being uncomfortable. We're so averse to being uncomfortable that, we tend to shy away from those challenges and we shy away from those things. And I think collectively we can share more stories, whether it's, I got up and I went to the gym today, even though, I didn't want to, or whatever those little things are. Becoming comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I think that, like you said, that's typically where you make your biggest gains.
Yes.
That's typically where, you're going to be furthest from disaster and those ground zero things in life is when you're actively doing something uncomfortable to move forward.
I think that plays into, one of the points that you were going to get into here is really, what do you do when you're wrong? There's nothing more uncomfortable than being wrong, knowing you're wrong. Now, what do you do in moving forward that? You're in that mire. It's not really ground zero, but it is a little bit of a diversion.
Well, and I think it goes back to the idea of finding those people that are trustworthy, finding those people that you can sit down with. And we've talked about accountability. I used to look at it as I always want to be in a close relationship with someone that's like a step and a half ahead of me in life. So when I had young kids, I wanted to be close with people that had teenage or college age kids because they had been through some of the things that I was going to be through. And if it's addiction or if it's, people struggle with their weight, whatever the struggle is, find those people that you kind of, wish you were, or people whose stories resonate with you. And you're like, I want some of that. Like you talk about Eric Foster. I mean, what a fantastic guy. And for you to be able to plug into him and be accountable to him and say, man, I really thought I was doing the right thing the other day and I blew it. Can you kind of coach me through this? I mean, we've all done kind of sports. You remember the best coach you've ever had. Mm-hmm. And we need to find those kind of, coaches in our life that are mentors that we can just be honest and transparent with. And we have to find those people that we trust.
I think there comes that place of understanding even how to have those healthy relationships, the trusting and dependency are such a fine line.
That's a whole nother topic.
That's for another show. We need 2 hours on that one. But it is that place where you have to have somebody that you trust that is going to help maintain those boundaries. Because if you can trust somebody all you want, but if they become your next codependency, you're kind of toast. I mean, for me, I have to have good relationships that input into the plan that is for my life, for what I will do and be accountable for and move forward. But I've been fortunate. God has actually brought into my life, for no choice of my own, these random human beings. You two represent that. Scott in the other room right now helping us through all this stuff is another one where you've all been put in my life in this place in life that actually has had a powerful impact on what I can be as a father, a contributor, working in front of people that are actually nowhere near there yet. They still haven't even stopped blowing up all the buildings at Ground Zero yet. But these influences, these people in our life, it's allowing them to be part of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just take a quick second here and talk about how if we could throw a dart on a date that you would both call your last Ground Zero. Look at where you are today. I mean, you're pouring into the community. You're following the plan that God has laid out for you. You're enjoying happier moments. They're not all happy. They're not all happy for any of us. But there was an option. You could have stayed there and you wouldn't have been here. And that's the thing that I want other people to see that might be, maybe they've just gotten out of their Ground Zero moment and they're just getting tired. They're kind of worn down and maybe they don't feel like they had that strength. But I'm saying, look at these two. Look at Caitlin and look at Chris and look at so many others that have chosen and been helped along another path. And all of these things we're talking about, finding the mentors, leaning into your higher power, leaning into what God is calling you to, doing all of these things, it can get tiring, but the option is to go back to Ground Zero. And that sucks.
Sure does.
Nobody wants to be there. And so where I say is, collectively, when people are watching this, these two people in front of you, I'm not trying to put them on a pedestal and say they're these awesome people. What I'm saying is look at where life can go, because there was a time in both of their lives when it was hopeless and they were in tons of pain, and their path changed. From their Ground Zero, they built something new. That's what we want people to understand.
The other side of that, I'd just like to say is that while it's important that we have a vivid reality of our own Ground Zero, we have no idea the depth of pain and things that others go through. Absolutely no idea. And that's where that appreciating other people, when it doesn't have to be an overdose scenario where Caitlin and I work with that situation a lot. It can be just somebody you met that looks like they're put together. They could look perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. Those assumptions, I think we miss an opportunity to come into lives of other people and pour into them and be an opportunity of hope for them when they're just maintaining life to just get through today. Mm-hmm. Our Ground Zero, we can't forget. We also have to recognize others have horrible experiences. And I learned a very valuable lesson in that last night. And I tell you, it changed my life, the story that came out of this human being. And as we were going into this, it just really struck me to say, I can think about my Ground Zero, but I also have to recognize this just absolute demolition that's going on in other people's lives. Some by their own making, but I can't dismiss them and say, well, you should have been okay. You're a little white girl from Pittsford. You should have been fine. No, it doesn't work that way, because Pittsford, for those that don't know, is considered an affluent community here in the Rochester area. You are a minority in the inner city. We expect that from you. We ignore that. And it's just obnoxious to me that we don't recognize the humanity behind it all.
Yeah. And I think that, like you said, it's that idea of appreciating others and, learning to appreciate the things that we don't understand. right? And I think that's what you're talking about, because
Yes.
if you can speak to, this was the path I took, so I can understand how someone would be feeling the same way that I did. But what if it's something totally different? What if your path included addiction, but it didn't include the loss of a family member, or it didn't include a horrible car wreck, or it didn't? You need to be able to understand, like you're saying. And I think that's where in law enforcement, where I learned some difficult lessons and carry a lot of guilt from early on, just looking at everybody the same and not valuing them as a human, and valuing the things that contributed to who they are today in this hot mess in front of me. Because I've been the same way, right? We've talked about that. Some of the stupid things I've done along the way that I could have been in that same circumstance. And I think this idea of appreciating others is super powerful. And I know that you both see that as you deal as peers, because you hear stories in front of you that are even worse than anything you've ever experienced. And you can truly sympathize with that.
Yeah, or, not even worse, but they're just different, and I couldn't even fathom that, this is the choice you would make, or and there's a lot of mental health issues. There's just a lot of factors that come into it, and I certainly meet all kinds of people, and the notion of meeting them where they're at, wherever they are at, and without judgment, and just accepting them and just saying, hey, here's my hand, let's walk together through this. I may not understand it, I may not have lived it, but again, that also brings me back to, there's quite a few similarities at the end of the day. Circumstances may be different, but overall we have so many similarities, and I think that gets dismissed sometimes, and we focus on just how different, who's more horrific, who has, has it worse, who should be this and that, and at the end of the day, the humanity.
And that's why I really draw with what you say. When you use the term haze, you're talking about that fog.
Mm-hmm.
That's so important, because it eliminates disease, choice. It eliminates you're being an idiot. I'm even just talking about addiction. When you're in this chaos of a broken life, a lot of times we place our notion of why they got there on them.
Absolutely.
And I think with the words that you use, I think it's so helpful to look at it and just say, just recognize there's a fog over their decision making.
Yep.
Regardless of what caused that fog. You had one at one point in your life too, I'm sure of it.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Not saying you personally, but others as well. And your idea of not knowing exactly where people are at as peers of anything, our eye contact with them is saying, I don't know exactly where you're at, but I know sort of where you're at because I've had that experience. Let's walk together and figure this thing out.
Because you matter.
Yeah, get beyond the fog. You're a human being too.
Yeah, I think that idea that, because you matter. And we can truly say that about everybody.
Absolutely.
We've said it before. I don't want people to know me for my worst moment. And so I cannot then put someone else's worst moment and be the descriptor on their life. Right. And so, and for me, it wasn't chemical addiction. It was anger. It still is. It's one of the things I continue to struggle with. And I've shared that before. But in my worst moments in anger, I would be embarrassed if there was like a video that you could play that moment in front of people, because it was absolutely awful. The kind of poison I would spew on people and the kinds of things that I would do, is terrible. And I don't want to be known for that. And there was a path forward, and there were some bumps along the way, but I cannot then turn around as a law enforcement officer, or as a neighbor, or someone at my church or at the library or the grocery store, and start pointing out, oh, look what that person did, and then make that their moniker.
Right. And you've talked about that. He's used, Brian's used an example actually this week, even again, around the idea of looking in the mirror and seeing the face that you make, even in that anger example. That looking in the mirror idea, regardless of your, saying, okay, this is what I look like when I'm talking to my kids angry. And this is that vivid reality is a rough one. And Brian even talks about how that torments him. But for me, it's headlines in the paper. It's how certain people, I assume they're looking at me or thinking based on what they knew to be true about me and haven't seen the gestational period of my recovery, That's
a big word for you.
It is.
That is.
I looked it up before we got here.
That's a good one. Good job.
I was trying to beat duffel bag. I told you I was competitive.
Yeah. And when you talk about looking in the mirror, I actually had a really vivid, literal looking in the mirror image come into my mind. And it was quite a few years ago. I had attempted suicide. And it was when I was obviously in one of the lowest trenches and, literally living in hell. And So I had gotten up out of my hospital bed, went into the bathroom, and I hadn't gotten up and actually walked in quite a while. And I looked in the mirror. My eyes were just literally black. You know, I looked like one of those dolls from one of the horror movies. I didn't recognize that girl. And that's not how I want to remember myself. And that's my ground zero, one of them, one of the many.
Yeah, that imagery is super powerful. And I think sometimes, and that just to kind of wrap up on that concept of vivid reality, it's sometimes we need to choose to bring that image back, right? There's sometimes when we need to, whether, we talk about 9/11, sometimes we need to remind people of what 9/11 was about. And that's why we do the security we do at airports. People are now frustrated and they don't want to take their shoes off and they don't want to do this other stuff. But if there were video screens before you went to TSA that showed the people bouncing off the pavement in front of the towers, it would probably change your attitude as you go into that, right? And I think sometimes in our life, when we've had those ground zeros, we get further ahead and we don't understand, why do we have to go through this process today? Why do we have to do this? But if we could put that image back up in our minds or follow some process to remind ourselves of what that reality, bring back the vividness to it. This is why I'm doing it.
Well, Brian, we're at that point where we're going to have to wrap up here, but Caitlin, huge add to the show. I really appreciate you having here. And Brian,
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, that's great. Brian, I don't know if you want to have any closing statements.
I love to close talking about the Learning to Appreciate mantra, and I'll just get through it quickly today. So the mantra is, I'm not perfect. Nobody is. I have value. Everybody does. And that's just something that I frequently say and that my buddy Alex and I worked on for a long time. And it's just a reminder of the commonness that we all have. And Caitlin spoke about this earlier. We all make mistakes. We all make bad choices. We all have bad things happen to us. And at the same time, we're all created by God and we all have that same common value. And I think if we focused a lot more on that, we would have less barriers, we would have better interactions. And I think that this idea of accountability and trustworthiness would grow within the relationships that we have. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Caitlin,
thank you.
Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Stay with us. We got a lot of changes we're working through. But I know the three of us in this room absolutely believe that change lives change lives.